Muammar Gaddafi's rise brought a kind of control where women in particular were singled out, punished, and humiliated in public in unimaginable ways. The memory of that fear left a mark on generations of Libyan women, and the scars of this control are still remembered today. Before Gaddafi even took power, Libya was a country where social rules mattered more than written laws. Under King Idris I, who ruled from 1951 to 1969, the state was weak and distant from daily life. Courts existed, but most disputes were handled through families, tribes, and local religious leaders. A person's reputation determined how they were treated far more than any legal ruling. For Libyan women, reputation was everything. A woman's future depended on how she was viewed by her community. Marriage prospects, safety, and family honor were all tied to public perception. If a woman was accused of immoral behavior, even without proof, the damage was often permanent. Families could refuse to defend her to avoid being shamed themselves. Marriage offers could disappear overnight. In some cases, families were forced to move to escape the stigma. There was no official way to clear a woman's name once it was questioned publicly. Gaddafi came into this system on September 1, 1969, when he led a group of young army officers and carried out a military coup against King Idris I. The king was not in Libya at the time. He was in Turkey for medical treatment, which left the government unprepared and unable to respond. The coup was completed in less than 24 hours. Radio stations, military bases, and government buildings were taken without major fighting. By morning, the monarchy that had ruled Libya since independence was gone. Immediately after taking power, the new regime suspended Libya's 1951 constitution. This document had provided basic legal protections, including limits on government power and the existence of courts that could review state actions. Parliament was dissolved. Political parties were banned, and judges were removed from cases involving national security. These steps happened quickly before any public debate could occur. From that moment on, there was no independent legal system left to protect citizens from the state. Power shifted away from laws and toward revolutionary authority. Gaddafi and the officers who supported him claimed they represented the will of the people, but no elections were held to prove this. Instead, decisions were made by military councils and later by revolutionary committees. These bodies were not bound by legal rules. They answered only to the revolution and ultimately to Gaddafi himself. Gaddafi described the coup as a moral reset for the country. He claimed that Libya needed to be purified from corruption, foreign influence, and disloyal behavior. Under this new thinking, loyalty became more important than evidence. Being accused of opposing the revolution was treated as proof of guilt. Courts were no longer needed because the revolution itself was presented as the highest form of justice. This change was especially dangerous for women. Under the old system, even though protections were limited, accusations still required some form of legal process. After 1969, that barrier disappeared. Accusation alone was enough to bring punishment. A rumor, a complaint, or an anonymous report could trigger an investigation and public exposure. There was no clear way to defend oneself or appeal a decision. At the same time, Gaddafi publicly claimed that women would benefit from the new order. He spoke about expanding education for girls, allowing women to work, and freeing them from what he described as old traditions. These statements helped him gain support and gave the impression of progress. However, this image hid a deeper shift in how women were viewed by the state. Between 1971 and 1975, Gaddafi built a new system to control everyday life in Libya. This system relied on groups known as revolutionary committees. These committees were placed inside universities, secondary schools, government offices, factories, and residential neighborhoods. Their members were usually loyal supporters of the regime, not trained judges or legal officials. They didn't follow court procedures, and they weren't required to present evidence. Their authority came directly from the revolution. The role of these committees was to monitor behavior and report anything that appeared disloyal or improper. Meetings were held regularly where individuals could be named, accused, and questioned in front of others. There was no clear rule about what counted as a violation. This lack of definition gave the committees full freedom to act. Women quickly became a main focus of this system. Female students and young working women were especially vulnerable because they were visible in public spaces such as schools, universities, and offices. Many were accused of moral violations rather than political crimes, because moral accusations were more damaging and easier to make. A woman could be accused of behaving improperly, rejecting revolutionary values, or copying foreign customs without any proof. Once accused, a woman was often summoned to a public setting. This could be a classroom, a lecture hall, a workplace meeting, or a neighborhood gathering. The accusation was read aloud in front of people she knew. Teachers, co-workers, classmates, and neighbors were forced to listen. The woman was expected to stand silently while her character was attacked. There was no opportunity to defend herself or question the accusation. These public denouncements were planned carefully. They were not spontaneous reactions. They were meant to humiliate and isolate. By punishing women in front of their peers, the regime ensured that the damage would follow them beyond the event itself. Afterward, classmates avoided them. Employers lost trust. Families felt pressure to distance themselves to avoid being targeted. Even when no physical punishment followed, the consequences were severe. The state learned that public exposure was more effective than imprisonment. Fear spread faster when everyone saw what happened. In March 1977, Gaddafi announced that Libya was no longer a republic, but a jamahiriya, which he described as a state run directly by the people. In reality, this change removed what legal structure still existed. Courts had already been weakened, and this declaration placed all real power in the hands of Gaddafi and the revolutionary committees. There were no checks on authority. Decisions about guilt and punishment were no longer tied to written law or independent judges. That same year, the regime introduced public execution as a regular tool to control society. Executions were planned, announced, and carried out in open spaces where large crowds would gather. Locations included city squares in Tripoli and Benghazi, football stadiums, and university campuses. These places were chosen because they were familiar and symbolic, especially schools and universities, which the regime saw as centers of possible resistance. Attendance at these executions was often mandatory. School administrators were ordered to send students. University staff were instructed to bring entire classes. Workers in nearby offices were told to leave their desks and watch. Refusing to attend could raise suspicion and lead to investigation. Some executions were broadcast on state television. Cameras focused on the event, while government announcers explained that the condemned were traitors, enemies of the revolution, or agents of foreign powers. There was no mention of trials, evidence, or defense. Women accused of political crimes were executed alongside men. These accusations often involved claims of opposing the revolution, spreading forbidden ideas, or maintaining ties with groups outside the country. When women were executed publicly, the impact was different and deeper. By killing women in public, the regime sent a message that no social role or cultural protection could shield anyone from punishment. The state media framed these women not only as political enemies, but also as morally corrupt. Their executions were presented as proof that they had betrayed social values, not just the government. This portrayal damaged their families as well. Relatives were quietly blamed and watched closely afterwards. Entire households could fall under suspicion because of one accused woman. Families were strictly warned not to show grief. Funerals were restricted or denied. Crying in public, wearing black, or speaking about the dead could lead to arrest. In some cases, families were forced to remain silent for years. The goal was to erase sympathy and prevent the condemned from becoming symbols of resistance. From the late 1970s onward, Gaddafi's government made detention without trial a routine method of control. Arrests no longer required clear charges, court orders, or evidence. Security forces, intelligence officers, and revolutionary committees could detain someone based on suspicion alone. For women, this often had nothing to do with their own actions. Guilt was extended through family ties. If a husband, brother, father, or even a distant relative was accused of opposing the regime, female family members could be taken as a warning to others. This practice was meant to break families and discourage any form of dissent by making the cost personal and unpredictable. Many of these women were taken during night raids. Security agents arrived without uniforms, often in unmarked vehicles, and removed women from their homes in front of children and neighbors. No arrest documents were provided. In most cases, families weren't told where the woman was being taken or why. This uncertainty was intentional. By denying information, the state created fear not only for the detainee, but for everyone connected to her. Some women were held in major prisons, while others placed in smaller, unofficial detention centers run directly by intelligence agencies or revolutionary committees. These facilities were not listed in public records. Conditions were harsh, cells were overcrowded, sanitation was poor, and access to medical care was limited or non-existent. Contact with the outside world was usually forbidden. Letters were blocked, visits denied, and lawyers not allowed. Detention periods were undefined. Some women were held for months without questioning. Others remained imprisoned for years without ever being formally charged. The lack of a timeline was part of the punishment. Not knowing when or if release would come created constant psychological pressure. Women were kept in a state of fear, unable to plan for the future or even understand what was expected of them to regain their freedom. In some cases, women were later brought back into public view. They might be forced to appear at public denunciations, televised confessions, or revolutionary meetings where they were accused of betrayal or moral corruption. Other women simply disappeared. Their families never received confirmation of death or release. The absence of information became a permanent wound. During the 1980s, Libya faced growing opposition from various groups. Islamist movements, which had existed quietly in the 1970s, became more organized and vocal. Some members of these groups criticized the government for restricting religion and traditional values, while others opposed Gaddafi's political control. At the same time, Libyans living abroad, including former government officials, military officers, and students, began speaking out openly against the regime. They wrote pamphlets, held meetings in neighboring countries like Egypt and Tunisia, and sometimes tried to coordinate resistance inside Libya. The regime viewed all of this activity as a serious threat. The increase in opposition created fear among the leadership. Gaddafi's security forces were aware that these groups could influence people inside the country, even without being physically present. The authorities worried that members of these opposition networks could inspire protests, organize attacks, or spread ideas that challenged the government. The regime also feared that any visible support for these groups, even from family members, could weaken its control. This period marked a shift in how the regime treated dissent. It was no longer enough to watch individuals suspected of opposing the government. The state began to pay attention to the wider networks surrounding them, including their families. Women in particular became targets because the government knew their social roles connected them to male relatives. By controlling or punishing women connected to opposition figures, the state aimed to weaken support for political groups and prevent the spread of dissent. After international sanctions were imposed on Libya in the early 1990s, the country faced severe economic collapse. But the public punishments still didn't stop. The sanctions were a response to the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland in 1988, and other international concerns about Libya's support for terrorism. These sanctions blocked Libya from accessing oil revenue, foreign banking, and trade, which were the main sources of income for the state. As a result, basic goods became scarce, including food, fuel, and medical supplies. Hospitals, schools, and public services struggled to operate. The population became heavily dependent on what the government could still provide. This dependence gave the state more leverage over ordinary citizens, making any form of disobedience or dissent even riskier. During this period, the public punishment of women continued, but it shifted in scale and method. Large televised executions or mass public humiliations became less common. Instead, the regime relied on smaller, localized punishments that took place in workplaces, schools, neighborhoods, and local community centers. These events were carefully controlled and aimed at those immediately surrounding the accused. By focusing on local spaces, the regime made the punishments more intimate, ensuring that women would feel the consequences directly in their daily lives. Women could be accused of many different offenses under this system. Speaking with foreign journalists, even for seemingly harmless reasons, could be interpreted as a betrayal of the state. Criticizing the shortages of food, medicine, or fuel in conversations at the market, school, or workplace could also trigger punishment. Attendance at unofficial gatherings, meetings not sanctioned by the state, social events outside government control, or religious gatherings seen as suspicious was another reason women were targeted. In each case, the accusations did not require proof. The terror reached its height in June 1996, when one of the most infamous events in modern Libyan history took place at Abu Salim prison in Tripoli. More than 1,200 prisoners were killed in a single massacre. The prisoners had been detained for years for a variety of reasons, including political opposition, suspected ties to Islamist movements, or even family connections to exiled dissidents. Abu Salim was a high-security prison, notorious for its harsh conditions, lack of legal oversight, and routine use of torture. Yet the scale of the June massacre was unprecedented. Guards and security forces carried out the killings in secret, and the regime successfully concealed the event from the public for many years. Women became central figures in the aftermath, even though the massacre itself primarily targeted men. Mothers, wives, sisters, and daughters began asking questions, demanding answers from a government that refused transparency. In Libyan society, women were often expected to be silent in political matters, but the loss of so many men forced women to step into public roles. They visited prisons, spoke with authorities, and tried to organize petitions, protests, or informal gatherings to learn the truth. These actions made them highly visible to the regime, which interpreted their demands for justice as a challenge to state authority. The state responded with intimidation. Women who protested were threatened with arrest, detention, or surveillance. Some were forcibly taken to interrogation centers and questioned about their motives and associations. Others were publicly humiliated in neighborhoods or workplaces, labeled as spreading false information or as troublemakers. In addition to direct intimidation, the regime used social pressure to control women's responses. Neighbors, co-workers, and extended family members were warned not to support or speak to women seeking information about Abu Salim. This created isolation and fear. Many women found themselves ostracized, their reputations questioned, and their families at risk simply for asking questions about loved ones who had disappeared. However, Gaddafi's brutality could not last long. And in February 2011, the wave of uprisings that began in Tunisia and Egypt reached Libya. The demonstrations were initially small, but spread quickly across cities, towns, and neighborhoods. People demanded political freedom, an end to corruption, and accountability for decades of oppression. Across Tripoli, Benghazi, Misrata, and other cities, women organized marches, created networks to coordinate protests, and distributed leaflets detailing government abuses. They used mobile phones, social media, and satellite phones to document violent crackdowns, arrests, and instances of public humiliation. Even in the most conservative regions, women joined alongside men, signaling that resistance was a family and community concern, not just a political one. In Benghazi, which quickly became the epicenter of the opposition, women were among the first to defy curfews and the constant surveillance of Gaddafi's security forces. They gathered in squares, sometimes with children in tow, chanting slogans against the regime. Their presence was a direct challenge to Gaddafi's long-standing system, which had relied on social shame to enforce obedience. The regime responded with tactics that were familiar but now under new scrutiny. Security forces and pro-Gaddafi militias attempted to discredit female protesters by accusing them of dishonor, moral corruption, and political betrayal. Rumors were spread through local media and neighborhood monitors, claiming that women participating in demonstrations had abandoned traditional values or were acting as agents of foreign powers. In some towns, women were threatened by local revolutionary committees or intelligence officers, told they would be publicly shamed or detained if they continued to protest. Male family members were also threatened, creating pressure for women to stop. But the scale of the uprising made these threats less effective than in previous decades. Despite these tactics, the protests continued to grow. By March 2011, Benghazi and other eastern cities were effectively outside the control of the central government. Women played key roles in sustaining the opposition, not only on the streets, but in organizing medical aid, food distribution, and shelter for displaced families. Their actions provided critical support for the fighters who were resisting government forces, especially in Misrata, where prolonged urban combat caused widespread destruction. Women acted as messengers between front lines, smuggled supplies into conflict zones, and recorded military movements for the opposition. The regime escalated its violent response as the protests spread. Snipers were deployed on rooftops, tanks rolled through city streets, and airstrikes targeted residential neighborhoods suspected of harboring anti-government activity. Women in these areas were frequently caught in crossfire or deliberately targeted. As the conflict intensified, international attention increased. By mid-2011, the United Nations had imposed a no-fly zone, and NATO began military intervention to protect civilians. The regime's capacity to control cities, suppress dissent, and isolate opposition weakened. In this period, the system of fear that had governed Libya for over 40 years began to collapse. Neighborhood monitors fled or switched sides. Revolutionary committees lost authority, and security forces disintegrated under sustained opposition pressure. The final phase of the regime's collapse was concentrated around Sirte, Gaddafi's hometown and last stronghold. Opposition fighters, supported in part by local civilians and NATO assistance, advanced into the city throughout October 2011. By October 20th, Gaddafi was killed while attempting to flee, and the constant fear, public punishment for women, finally ended.